I hope that you all found the time together over lunch to be stimulating, and you were able to begin to build the relationships that will help us find new ways to collaborate. I'm excited to welcome Matt Leininger to the stage. Matt's a former colleague here at the National Conference on Citizenship and is now the Vice President at the National Civic League, where he directs the Center for Democracy Innovation. Matt's an author and a leading thinker in the field of citizen-led democracy and has worked for years to find new ways to strengthen civic infrastructure, use technology to scale engagement, and measure the quality of participation in our democracy. Matt's going to lead a discussion with an esteemed group of funders from across the field who will explore how collaborative funding models can improve the long-term outlook for civic resilience. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome to our panel on collaborative funding models for civic resilience. Welcome also to the post-lunch lull. We all had some great food from Immigrant Foods. They do a terrific job, and I know that the food will be settling into your system. So please know, if I see people nodding off halfway through, we were going to have to do calisthenics. So just make sure we're going to try to keep it snappy for you up here to keep you awake and entertained. And we're going to just start off by having each of our panelists here do a brief introduction of themselves, and then we'll jump into the first question. Gary?
Hi, I'm Gary Bass, and I probably should stop there so I can be snappy. I, for about 3 decades, ran a national organization that dealt with a whole host. I had to try and raise money from funders. And then for about a dozen years, ran a foundation, and now I'm very involved in 3 funder collaboratives.
Awesome. Kumar?
Great to be here. Thanks for having me. Kumar Garg. I'm the president of Renaissance Philanthropy. My background is as a policymaker. I served in the Obama administration for the President Obama Science Advisor for many years, then worked for Eric Schmidt on his Science and Tech Foundation. And now Renaissance Philanthropy raises money from donors and builds science and tech programs, and then is a grant maker itself. We focus mostly on emerging technologies, so things like AI, energy and climate, global development, human health, and economic and social mobility.
Awesome. Thank you. Catherine?
I'm Catherine Peters. I'm joining here today wearing my hat as a partner at New Profit. We are a philanthropy entity based out of Boston, but nationally working that it's a really highly collaborative group by design. So we provide not just funding, capital, but also capacity and community, and really show up and get to collaborate with social entrepreneurs who are building a better democracy, a better education system, a better economic future, by really showing up with that deep, consistent engagement alongside the funding. So I'm really excited to be bringing my background as having been in the democracy space and having built some of those organizations, and now getting to be here newly arrived to putting on a philanthropist hat and helping support that work. So thanks.
Wafa?
Hi, everybody. My name is Wafa Ben Hassin. I'm at a Media Network. I'm a director on our programs and policy team based here in Washington, D.C. I mean, I come at this conversation from the background of being a human rights lawyer. Most of my career has been with civil society organizations working on human rights online. I've been at a Media Network for about 5 years now, and at ON, we focus specifically on supporting civil society in the tech revolution. And so our motto is hardwiring humanity into technology, and I think it's a very exciting time to be doing that kind of work, and I'm also really keen to dig into the conversation to identify what we can do better.
Absolutely.
Well, we want to start with the big context and the fact that we seem to be in a period of chaotic, painful, dramatic change in all kinds of institutions, philanthropic institutions, governmental institutions, all kinds of groups. And to give you some of that larger context, I want to reflect on the fact that the Civic League, the National Civic League, which is my employer, was founded at a time when democracy was in trouble, polarization was high, trust and inequality, trust was low, inequality was high. It was founded in 1894 by Teddy Roosevelt and Louis Brandeis and other kind of civic reformers of the day. And it was part of that period that was dramatic, painful, chaotic, of change in government institutions in particular. So as you may know, all kinds of civic reforms come out of that time period. About 100 years ago, the city manager form of government, the model city charter, women's suffrage, ballot initiatives and referendum process, all kinds of things come out of that period where what we were doing is trying to plug innovations, many of which already existed, but plug innovations into the system of democracy where they had not been. This is also a time period where there was dramatic change in terms of philanthropy. So, a lot of the big, most well-known, Rockefeller, Ford, Carnegie, a lot of the big foundations come out of that time period. A lot of the whole idea of philanthropy, and you all can comment on this better than I can, comes out of that time period. So 100 years later, after a century of civic reforms that have largely served us pretty well, we can debate about that. But we're clearly at a point where there's got to be changes. In one kind or another in all these institutions, a lot of institutions are changing to try to kind of meet the demands, the opportunities, the challenges of citizens and democracy today. So we want to start there, and I know a lot of you are experiencing this firsthand, and it kind of in the midst of all of this civic innovation and civic upheaval, kind of curious about the kinds of pressures, innovations, reactions, trends that you're seeing. I want to start with Wefa and then to the rest of you. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a very fluid and uncertain time all around, not just for funding, but also just the civic health environment overall. We're seeing a lot of pressures in terms of the uncertainty that I mentioned just now, which is causing this effect on philanthropies to just kind of react to the next thing. And really, they're being pulled towards the urgency of the crises that we're seeing all around us. And so that makes long-term planning really hard. We get sucked into short-termism where you're constantly revising your strategy every 4 months, every 5 months, which is just a reality of the situation at hand. I think also one very important thing that we're seeing is that technology is advancing at such a rapid pace. And the environment is, when we talk about civic health, whether it's information ecosystems or community organizing or even connecting with one another, the digital space is just so critical. We were speaking about this yesterday in terms of it being critical social infrastructure, whether it's online platforms or whether it's artificial intelligence or all the tools that people use every day to connect with one another. And the reality is that those technologies are advancing so rapidly that even funders can't respond to what the challenges are and kind of looking at where to best inject our support and our funds. The other thing is that the environment is just so concentrated by a handful of tech companies that are just dominating the conversation. We used to joke about social media being this way a while ago, but at least with social media, there was a semblance of polity or civility of inviting civil society into consultations. Yeah, sure, they never followed up, but at least there was something there. Whereas with AI companies today, there's none of that. They announce a fund every now and again, but it's peanuts compared to their annual revenues. I was just at the Anthropic thing yesterday, and they said they had a $7 billion revenue, which I think is on the low end, by the way. And they announced a $10 million fund to look at labor and AI. So I think I don't want to speak for all of us. Exactly. That's we talk about philanthropic math. That's like tech company math. But I don't want to speak for all of us on this stage. But 10 million out of I don't know how many billion is nothing, and we can't backfill that. Nor can we backfill USG. And I think there's just a lot of challenges even for us as funders to look at what is most catalytic right now. Where can we be most effective, and then how can we? And later we'll talk about this. How can we look at different models of actually being more effective, whether that means collaborating more or coming up with more creative ideas? So I'll stop there for now, but I hope, that sheds some light on the situation.
Excellent. Gary?
How many of you rely on non-governmental funding, like foundation funding? Look at that. Wow. Almost everyone in the room. I think it's safe to say that philanthropy has an essential, critical role in funding whatever we want to call this of civic resilience, civic engagement, other forms of participatory democracy. We need more of that. But having said that, let me highlight a couple things where there's really a kind of strange dynamic that it doesn't fit well with social change. Let me make a couple points. First, social change occurs in the matter of decades, not grant years in 3 or 4 year cycles. Social change doesn't occur in project-supported grants. It occurs with the gold standard of funding, which is general support and ongoing support. I think there are a host of other deep-seated, if you will, disconnects. Funders move in herds. You know,
Yes.
I mean, there isn't anybody who wouldn't laugh at that because we all recognize how that happens. You know, whatever is the shiny new thing, many of the funders congregate around that newer thing, and like herds, they shift quickly from one direction to the other. And meanwhile, for those of us who are engaged in long-term social change, it throws an enormous loop in any opportunity for continuity. Third, I think that we all recognize, like any organization, there's personnel changes in foundations. Whether it's the CEO, who has enormous influence around priorities, or for that matter, your program officer has enormous control. And when that program officer leaves, it may change virtually everything that was part of the long-term plan.
Yep.
The last point I would make on this is that no single foundation has the ability to create meaningful social change. No matter how big you are, it is a sustained, combined effort. Having said all this, let me just add, that alone raises lots of concerns. But this environment that you asked about, Matt,
Right.
we are in an environment where things like DEI, gender, climate are under attack. And that isn't just for funders, that's for grantees, too. Now, this conversation is about funders, and for funders, they too are under attack. And that makes it that much harder. And the attack could be, by the way, in many forms. It could be congressional oversight. It could be threats of loss of tax exemption. It could be just simply public pressure. And frankly, all of us in this room understand foundations. Boards don't like public attention, frankly. So this is a serious problem about attacks. What happened yesterday over the appalling assassination of Charlie Kirk may just add to this dynamic that is happening now. And what I mean by that is, while this is a moment in time where left and right should be finding ways to tone down the rhetoric and talk more civilly with one another and learn to listen, what we had yesterday is the vice president going after two foundations, Open Society Foundations and the Ford Foundation, with unfounded claims about them supporting an article in The Nation that he, the vice president, didn't like. This is only going to add ammunition and concern for funders in terms of their engagement. So let me stop there. And I mean, I have more to say on this. and by the way, I think there's good news to tell.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a lot of good news. One point just to say before I turn it over. I mean, I think it's remarkable the growth in democracy portfolios within foundations over the last number of years. And if it isn't a portfolio, many of the foundations are now supporting, even in existing portfolios, democracy-related work. Yeah. That's a real plus, and I can go on with other pluses.
Awesome. Catherine and Kumar, do you want to jump in on this one, or there'll be other ones?
I'll jump in, but
Yeah.
no, but please go first.
No, please. I think the only point I would sort of add in, I think this builds on your point around like the history of philanthropy, is just that a lot of the major philanthropic organizations that exist have learned lessons from the previous generation.
Right.
So a lot of what are the largest philanthropic organizations today said, well, what is the structure of what a foundation looks like? Yeah. And looked to the mid-century,
Right.
which was basically like a professional staff. And so the reason I think that's important is I draw a comparison. One of the things when I talk to donors, I draw a comparison, is between the way the investment world structures itself and the way the philanthropic world structures itself. In the investment world, most folks who have capital to deploy operate at the capital level with relatively small teams. So if you go to most folks no matter how well they've done, they have a family office that doesn't exceed 50. They might be deploying $30 to $40 billion annually out there into the investment world. What those 50 people do is they go out there and they actually find what are called intermediaries, private equity funds, venture capital funds, lots of intermediaries that are experts in their domain of the world and their subject area, and they bet on them and say, you go out there and go seek out returns, and we manage the family office. And that two-tier structure allows a huge amount of dynamism around how investment capital happens, because everyone gets to be expert at their own level. You get to be expert on your domains, and other people get to be expert. And when people change strategy, it does not cause the end of the world, because people are flowing in and out of various sectors. In philanthropy, we have done a vertically integrated structure. So both the donor and the staff and the decision-making all sit in one organization. So when the herding happens, it causes a huge change because everything changes in one move. It is not that, I'm going to roll off this fund and add more exposure to this area. And so one of the things that, and so today, the largest foundations emulate our research agencies, right? The National Science Foundation is 2,000 people. It gives out $8 billion a year. That sounds like another major foundation that gives out $8 billion a year and has 2,000 staff, right? That's basic structure. It is a very good way of running a vertically integrated organization. You can make good decisions, but what that means is changes in direction have a big question. So I think the thing that I think is an area of opportunity is right now, overall amount of philanthropic giving is minuscule. We are under 2% for folks who have done well as to what their giving rates are. So you can either say, this is just the way of the world, or what you can say is, this is actually a sign that we have created basically one structure, which is most people do not want to run really big organizations as like the way they're going to have impact in the world. Most people want offices of 50 and under. And so it's on us. And so I think the folks who are on the stage who are building these collaborative models that can, like New Profit and others, that can absorb capital are actually where I think the world has to go. It would give donors a lot more ability to bet on topics they care about without having to have all of the in-house infrastructure. So that's one, when we think about it in science and tech, think that that's going to be a way folks to bet in, but whether you're betting on democracy or others. So I do want to sort of suggest that most people when they opine about philanthropy are talking about the numerator. It is the 1.2% of current giving. And we could also spend a lot more time on saying, what is the denominator? What is the overall amount? And I would say that delta is pretty wide, which means we could actually be trying to substantially increase the amount of giving that happens by creating more options for donors.
You could not have made a better case for us as that second philanthropic layer. Thank you so much for pitching my work. I think to re-engage with some of the points that Gary and Wefa were making here, I don't want to pretend we're in an easy moment. I was recently reading a book called Meditations for Mortals. It's meant to be a bit about sort of time management and identifying your own personal priorities. It's a bit of a self-help title. But it introduced the concept of playing in the ruins. And the idea of that was around accepting how much of your own personal accomplishment or goals you might not ever fulfill, and identifying still what felt meaningful to advance and what you could find purpose in. And it felt less personal to me than about this moment in this field and this work. I think to some degree what we are doing in this room is playing in the ruins, and really identifying what work still matters most and what ways we can move forward that give us a sense of building a better future while also recognizing what a hard present we're in, and without pretending that there's going to be a magic wand that puts us back on the stable footing we might want of a decade ago. I also really appreciated on the first panel this morning, for those of you who got to be here, that I believe it was Bryna at the Humboldt Foundation really told a story that accepted some of the failures of some of her previous chapters in philanthropy that led her to local, from sort of seeing how large national and international funders were sometimes too distant from the problem, and how that lack of proximity led them to really over-standardizing. And I might be paraphrasing her poorly, but I would say that if I'm looking at this moment, I'm seeing a few things. And one is that need to accept our past failures. I say this as someone who's been identifying as working in the democracy field for 15 years. One of my early hypotheses was if we make voting really easy and we invite everyone in, more people will participate and our elections will be more robust. I can't believe how wrong some of that was. Like that, it was a valuable piece of work to do, and I put a lot of years and energy to it. So I think one is accepting where we are. Two is accepting the things that we've tried that haven't worked and haven't moved the needle. Some of the need will be to stop doing some of what we've been doing. And then when I think more hopefully, I think some of the best opportunity for collaboration, and we've talked about collaborative funding, is around thinking about that long term, building the vision. There's such a hunger for more leadership and imagination, getting out of just the short term, just being in these ruins and reacting to them, and thinking about where we're going to go. And I think that creates huge opportunities for coming together and working together. I think imagination is a really powerful collective activity rather than an individual one. And then I think the second is that when we're talking a lot about local, one of the things I'm hearing is this, like, honestly, Kumar, it's almost a little bit of an opposite. It's a little the deprofessionalizing of it. It's accepting that in building these national stabs and these truly professional entities, we've taken a lot of the leadership and a lot of the building and a lot of the power out of local and these more grassroots, and doling it back out and doing it slower and less perfectly and working at that speed of trust. I think the panel on women's leadership that was in here just before lunch really touched on that not having the person who has the formal degree in it really is maybe not the right way to worry about it. Really having the people who are closest to the problem working on it, and really giving more people opportunities for leadership and agency is another really powerful opportunity in this moment that I'm seeing and I'm excited about. So
Awesome.
I'll see where that takes us.
Yeah. Well, and some examples of that we want to zero in on, or maybe part of the good news, are the things we've been asked to talk about, which were, cross-sector collaborations, public-private partnerships, coalition building with unlikely allies for long-term systems change. So again, also the kind of the long-term question as well. And there's so many potential partners and collaborators and allies out there. So one of the things we do at the League, we have this healthy democracy ecosystem map where we've been trying to catalog all the organizations in America that are doing something, service, civic ed, participation, decision-making, something else, something to strengthen democracy. And we have 11,000 groups on the map. One thing about, so there are all these people one can be partnering with. One thing that's interesting about that is you talked about groups under 50. Well, I would say that 95% of those groups are under, and probably 85% are under 10. Yeah. These are teeny tiny nonprofits, often 1 or 2 person nonprofits. This is the landscape, that we're dealing. So, which I think presents both a challenge and certainly some opportunities, because there are some, as you say, people who are close to the problems. Yeah. So I'm curious about your experiences in these sorts of partnerships, unlikely allies, collaborations, coalitions. Where are you seeing the growth? What are your experiences? What are we learning from those sorts of things?
I could take a first stab at that. I really appreciated Kumar's bigger picture view of how structural the issues are and how investment works and the different models. But if we kind of zoom in also operationally, and I'll talk about this and then I'll also talk about collaborative funding models, we see that at least the way we do philanthropy today is still, like I mentioned earlier, the old way of doing philanthropy. Even things such as due diligence of different organizations, how we get money out the door. We over-strategize. I think there are 2 schools of thought on how to meet the moment today. One school of thought is that we have to be really, really careful and make sure everything we do is tip-top perfect, and that whatever investment we make has to really have an ROI or some sort of trackable way you can say that we have, contributed to this, victory or win or whatever you want to call it. Another school of thought is get moving. Stop over strategizing. I think it's the over professionalization as well that is part of the problem. And which leads me to your point, Catherine, is that now is the moment to also engage in co-funding models of working with those communities that are most affected by a problem, because guess what? They can be quicker, they can be more agile, more effective, more insightful in terms of diligence. And by the way, you don't really have to do diligence when you're seeing somebody every day for 2 weeks. So it's I think there are many different ways of engaging with this that are just much more refreshing. And especially to me today, again, I mentioned technology at the beginning, it's just we're living at a time where there's no way we can compete with the lobbying dollars of different tech companies. Insert company here, or insert whatever here. I think there's just no possible way to compete with that. So we have to be a lot faster. And I think that has been one frustration of mine in terms of like trying to get, my own colleagues, myself even, to be faster in how I do the diligence and how I speak with folks, et cetera. And so I think that that's certainly operationally part of the problem. And we're trying to be better. I mean, what can I say? Like, I think it just takes some time. Like we mentioned earlier, the early 20th century and how a lot of these philanthropies came about to begin with. That was a very, very different time. And I think sometimes even if we make mistakes by making different grants that may not check all the boxes, at least we're doing something. At least we're acting and reacting to the moment. And I think that's what's needed right now.
Anybody else want to jump in?
I agree. I mean, I guess the hard part I often find is that, people said, philanthropic boards. I generally think that staff always feel like the rug gets pulled from under them, right? So the dynamic is not the staff are the problem. It's that the staff say, okay, you gave us, let's go figure out this area. And the board says, well, we don't want to make too big of a bet, so why don't you do some test work? And so they go out there, they talk to everybody in the community, they build up expectations, they come, they do some test grants, and the board is like, I think we're changing direction. And you're like, well, what about all the expectations I made out there in the community?
Right.
And so the piece that the reason I was making the case for the two-tier structure is I think at the moment of interest, you get the money, right? That you go to the board and you say, you're really interested in this topic, how much do you want to deploy on it? Sign the check and the decision is done.
Strike while the iron's hot. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And then somebody else makes then goes out, does both fast giving, collaborative giving, on the ground giving, but doesn't have any risk of the rug pulling. So I think the dynamic that really drives everyone who has ever gone into philanthropy and then leaves philanthropy insane is that there is a disconnect between folks who are the final deciders of the allocation and then the staff and the timelines they're on. So no one ever completes their 5-year strategy.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
2 years in,
Right.
it's like we're off to the next strategy. So one of the big things I always say to people is, if you could get half the money, but all of it up front, that is a much better investment because then they can go do the work. They will come back to you in 3 years, 5 years, and say, here's what we did with it. You gave us less, but you gave us the ability to actually own the result.
Right.
And I think the problem is that everyone is in a crawl, walk, run, but you never get to run. You barely get to walk, and then, the next crisis happens, the political mood shifts, people have, the world will always be complicated, right? When I used to work in the government, a White House has a crisis every day. So if what we said to the agencies was, we're going to keep changing the strategy on you every time there's a fire drill, it's there's 4 fire drills every day. You don't get the smart way to organize systems is deep work and long-term work and on-the-ground work happens, and then some of it rolls up, and you say, oh, what did we do? And so I would like a system in which integrated philanthropy can operate at both speeds, but I've been in lots of these rooms, and it's just they're well, it's boards have buyer's remorse. Yes, we said yes to this 18 months ago, but the world has changed. And my view is we've got to move from off that system in one way or another. So I agree. It's just, it's not the staff that are the problem.
Well, and tell me if you disagree, but part of this is about trust.
Yes.
Grantees and program officers and people build trust, and that if there's a constant changing in strategy or there's the money, there's not the money, we're going, you're diminishing the trust, which is at the foundation of successful working relationships to implement something with the money. So that, go ahead, Catherine.
No, I'm in complete agreement, and I think that there's an element that I'm hearing Kumar you say is that that trust is often very closely interpersonal, and it's between 2 levels in a system. And the more you have to run a given decision or a given strategy up and down all of the levels, you have to work at the patience of trust at every node in that, and it slows everything down in a way. Whereas, like, if at any given moment you can operate on that trust in one and really delegate that down, the term we use for that at New Profit and that I've been hearing in the room today is proximity, right? It's the element of once you've established the trust the first time, instead of having to run it back and forth a whole lot more, like really put more weight on that trust. Put the money down closer and push it down further. Let the trust operate at each level, maybe only once, and get things moving through that system rather than relying on playing a game of telephone forever is maybe I don't know if that's a fair paraphrase, but I think that allows both the speed of trust to come into play and the strategy is just put it to the next level more proximate, and once it's there, keep it there. Let's not keep pulling it back.
Right, yes. Go ahead, Gary.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think,
Go ahead, please.
And then Wefa.
this conversation is really helpful at a theoretical level. Rome is burning. You know, we need to get down to brass tacks around funders who are cautious about supporting civic engagement. That is the bottom line. And when funders are nervous or under attack, they go into a shell. And I can tell you from experience, I run 2 collaboratives, 3 now. 2 are on sensitive subjects, the census and redistricting. You can't have good voting unless you also have good districts. You can't have good districts unless you count everyone. That's what civic engagement is about, is an integrated model of looking at census, redistricting, and voting to empower people. How are we going to fund that? Now. Not when we have a new structure, which I don't disagree with any of the 3 of you have been saying. But we have got to come up with new mechanisms to support these kinds of activities that groups on the ground, and by the way, funding should not just be groups on the ground, it needs to also be the national organizations. We've just seen this real shift. And as a result, what we have is a weakening of the national organizations at a time when we really need national voices in a growing autocracy. So, you know, we shouldn't be applauding. We should be putting our heads together in this room, talking about what does it take now. I am mindful. I attended a memorial service, a celebration last night for, if you will, the advocate's advocate. You probably don't know her, Nancy Amadei. You remember ketchup is a vegetable? She was the one who coined ketchup as a vegetable. Nancy would always talk about the importance of advocacy and engagement. And at the memorial, someone read an article she wrote in 1982 about the 1981 reconciliation bill that passed. And the point made in the article was people who for a generation were fighting for programs are bereft because the programs were all killed. We shifted in terms of block grants. The whole community of all of us in this room were paralyzed. No one knew what to do. She had a series of action steps. The last one was, don't give up. And I think that needs to be resoundingly said at this moment in time, that we have got to, all of us, not give up in this struggle to produce and protect health and safety, economic security, and our vibrant democracy.
I totally agree. I think just one note is that I think funders have to make some pretty hard choices. As you had mentioned, I think there's been a lot of different pressures that we've been feeling. You know, a lot of my grantees have been harassed. It's not a fun position to be in as a grantor, to hear about your grantee going through so much and having your own hands tied about, you know, I can't really support when it comes to crisis comms, or I can't really support when it comes to legal fees. Unfortunately, I would like to, but we just don't have the budget for that right now, or whatever it is. And in my case, at least, I had a whole portfolio of different organizations that were, I think 75% of them were like going through something because of a lot of politics. And so that's really hard for philanthropies to absorb. And I think some of the things that we have to do, I mean, it's funny, we're all sitting here on this stage, but we also have to influence each other in terms of the direction that we want to go, right? And I think oftentimes, I mean, speaking from my own vantage point and my own experience, once again, I come from the human rights community, so I've noticed that over time, and I've been in this field for about 15 years, we sometimes do these like purity tests about, you know, do I want to work with you? Do I agree with you on like everything from A to Z so that I can collaborate with you? And I think that is just so wrong. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you I never did that. I mean, I think I was guilty of doing that myself, but ultimately there's only so many resources to go around, and there has to be a melding of the values somewhere, right? Like we have to talk to each other both as funders within, you know, our own spaces, but also civil society organizations need to be a little bit more open with working together. You know, even if we don't agree on every single thing, ultimately we have to be much more discrete in terms of and narrow and vertical in how we address different issues. Discrete not as in secret, or discrete as in like small and targeted, you know, and I think to do that, you have to acknowledge, or we have to acknowledge that I might not agree with you on what you said on X topic, but I really agree with you on like child safety online, or making our online information ecosystem safer, or even interacting with different types of organizations, right? Like, so for instance, in our case, in the philanthropic space, I mean, there's a lot of talk about, I'll just say it, but there's a lot of talk about like effective altruists. And for those of you who don't know, it's a movement that, you know, I mean, I don't know, there's a lot to critique about it, but essentially to simplify in the quickest way possible, but it's a movement that looks to quantify impact as opposed to like qualifying it, right? So they would call, I mean, obviously not, this is not exactly accurate, but like human impact would be determined to be an externality, for instance. And you're like, well, no, that's not an externality. That's like somebody losing their home because of something. So, but a lot of this movement has been funding different AI safety groups around DC, and these organizations have been cropping up everywhere. And the reality is that, well, we have to start thinking about, well, do we want to work with these kinds of individuals? Like, are we open to collaborating on certain things? I don't know. I mean, I think we're still trying to figure that out, but I do think that we have to be discreet, we have to be smart, we have to be really tactical in terms of, you know, this is one thing we want to work on together. Let's make it a time-bound initiative where, you know, you're quickly trying to achieve something together. And eventually when you have, these are all different systems operating together, right? It's not just a cause and effect, or it's not black and white. Ultimately, when you have a lot of those different types of impacts piling up, like you will start to see change in the longer term and at a bigger picture. And I think as funders, we have to satisfy ourselves sometimes by saying, look, I mean, you're not going to see the end result right away. It's not going to be like a cause and effect, but you know, you have to rest assured that you're contributing along with other funders to a greater, larger values-aligned goal. So,
I think not to try to come up with a facile answer to a genuine challenge that you've issued the room, Gary, but there was a question at the end of the panel on women's leadership that asked for women who are stepping up and taking on these public roles and really leading in this moment, how do we think about providing safety? And how do we think about the risk that comes from being a visible woman leader? And for those of you who weren't in the room, it was a panel entirely of Black women. So really thinking about how race and gender and identity come in to really disproportionately harm some of the people who do step up and lead in this moment. But I think that the answer that the panel gave that was most powerful was together. You don't go it alone. If you're going to be up there as the public face, like, know who your network is behind you, know who shows up to support you, know who's providing you a home if you're getting doxxed, know who can think about physical security for you. And I think when you ask about like foundations feeling spooked or skittish, in some ways this herd mentality can help us. That if one is really standing firm and able to do that, I think others feel a little more secure doing it. There is a safety in numbers. There's a safety in the coalitions you're building. There is a safety in opening up general funding that can cover legal pieces and comp support, maybe not as dedicated add-on grants, but that allow the funds to get used for those things, and really providing that sort of shared infrastructure for bravery. And I'm very much thinking about what that looks like in this moment.
And one part of the building of the numbers, as you've been talking about, Kumar, is kind of bringing in other investors, donors. There's wealth out there in the world, yes. You know, and a flip side of this crisis is there are more people than ever who are concerned yes. about what we're all facing. But there's the point here, but like you were saying, Gary, about how do you help them step up? So I'm curious, how do you kind of?
Yeah.
I think there's a couple of things. I mean, I think one is, I do think it is useful to take salient topics that people find motivating and cut across non-traditional ideological lines and use that as a way to forge new ways of working together. So if you take like housing, for example,
Right.
you know, every major piece of housing legislation that is passing at the local level brings together non-traditional coalitions that, you know, often include unions, often include, you know, housing advocates, often will include builders, will often include folks who are on the, you know, both sides of the ideological aisle. It's also like a really interesting act of like civic work, you know,
Right.
you know, how are people showing up in these settings? Building that community, that activism, and then saying, we got that done, what else can we work on together, is very powerful.
Yep.
It also, when you then go out to donors, there might be donors, like when we sort of interview people who are on the sidelines, we're like, what topics are like worrying you about the world? They will say democracy, they will say housing, they will say AI and jobs, they will say, you know, climate. Like there's like salient topics. So if you can then say, well, actually on some of these topics, there's stuff to be done, it gets them more activated and involved. So I think on Gary's question around don't give up, I think like there's a version of don't give up, which is you're already like in it, and like there's peers who help you get it. But then there's like folks who are like, they need theories of traction. Like what is it that I could do that feels like it would do something rather than, you know, kind of I'm going to do it because I should. And so I think it sounds kind of pedantic, but like you have to pick things that you can then go off and then show. Like, yeah, remember, we came to you, now we went and we got this thing passed, or we got this coalition built and we're getting traction. So, I mean, it's good old organizing, but like you have to pick things that you can get traction on.
Yep.
That's how you build momentum on things. And so I think on the ground, picking topics where you can build those coalitions ends up being useful. And it's also a way to then grow the pie on the donor side.
The abstract is never as motivating as a true concrete vision that you can see progress toward. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
in terms of that vision, I mean, part of our, one of you said this in the prep, is, you know, part of our problem is that we always assume the future is going to be like whatever we have right now, or the recent past, and it never is. And in a period of dramatic change, and Wefa, you referenced the technological changes as well as everything else, how do we, in a time when people are so, you know, baffled by all the stuff we're living through, how do you kind of help people anticipate the future in ways that are concrete, that kind of lead to a vision? I mean, are there any kind of thoughts about that?
I'm no futurist. And if I try to describe a methodology, I think you would laugh at me. But I think for me, the thing that I find most attractive about futures thinking and some of the methodologies that are there is that they require stepping back from your expertise and what you know, where you tend to say, like, if we get proportionate representation, this is how voting will be different, this is how representation will be different, but we haven't thought about the other ways that the world will be different by the time we get to that.
Yeah.
So you have to step back and say, okay, well, what do climate leaders say about how mobile populations will be in the light of higher wildfire risk and higher hurricane risk? Like, does our system account for a more mobile electorate across these districts? What do demographers say about who those folks are going to be and the ages? And what do economists say about like what the opportunity will be and how equal or unequal that society will be? And how do all of those things play in with our proportionate representation? And so for me, futures thinking is automatically a collaborative exercise because you have to sort of step away from what you know best and bring in these other sources of expertise. It's a great opportunity to hear from others. It can be a coalition builder because then what can come out of it is much more concrete, not only in the sense of not just being an abstract vision, but in the sense of everyone can see a place for themselves in that shared North Star, that there's different contributions from those different pieces, but you can put people swimming in the same direction across an issue once you've had a chance to do that. So that's where my excitement comes from.
No, I completely agree. Yeah.
I guess in a pluralistic society, we can't predict the future. And what is the advantage of pluralism is everyone has a slightly different vision for the future. But it seems to me that we need to address the kind of tension that exists today where there is less tolerance. There is very little civility. We're seeing it in the political violence that is happening. And instead of pointing to the left or the right, we should be talking about how do we change things so we listen to one another. we can civilly disagree. That's one critical thing. I think the second is in order to get to a better future, we're going to have to deal with what I guess I would call economic inequality. And until we get some fairness, people are always going to feel they've gotten the shaft. And the third, which is always the item in the room that people are fearful of talking about, we are a society with changing demographics. We are a country with a historically white, solidly white majority, and in a few years, whites are not going to be in the majority, people of color are going to be in the majority. That is a vastly different kind of society.
I want to give you all a few minutes here. We've got, I think, 10 minutes. There's a sign that says 10 minutes. To ask a few questions or civilly disagree with our panelists. And let's take a batch of them, maybe 3 at a time, and we'll just do as many as we can get to. But raise your hand. One over here, one there, and then one to your left. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Libby Steger. I'm with an organization called Civic Bridgers. And my question is, as you all are working on these funder collaboratives and different ways of pooling funds and things like that, I recognize that it doesn't always behoove you to have practitioners in the room because of meaningful power dynamic differences. What are some recommendations you have for practitioners to inform that work, because we know what we're seeing on the ground, while not saying, well, we need to have a seat at the table? So just interested in your insights there.
Excellent. Yeah. There was one right there, and then there's one here. Yeah. Yeah, him right here. Sorry.
Hi, thanks so much. Really interesting conversation. My name is Matt Rumsey. I've worked in the nonprofit space, small nonprofits, for my whole career, so some of the stories that were telling definitely hit home to me. I guess, question for everyone, but specifically Kumar, I think your thesis is really interesting, and I think you did a good job of describing some of the problems with the current philanthropic setup, and I think throughout the conversation, Catherine specifically described some of the values of the current setup. So interested to hear a little bit more tactically, like how are you, Kumar, going about, instituting this vision that you have, and then more generally, like how are you all sort of thinking about the change in this space?
Awesome. And then one more gentleman in the red shirt here. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for the interesting points brought up. My name is Sean Wong. I'm from the Center for Civic Design. And I think my question kind of is a different flavor from actually both questions being asked. Obviously, this panel is from the funder's perspective. And I recognize that some of the different models that you guys have discussed help provides different kinds of flexibility to organizations that depend on philanthropic support. But also, I think there's often a stereotype about pool funds that in one way, that's also a mechanism for some of the more established funders to have more anonymity, right? And I think we're in an environment where we're seeing a lot of funders doing these things. So from the grantee's perspective, that kind of like added layer of opaqueness, do you have any recommendations as to how organizations in this room can also navigate some of these changes that you guys are either already implementing, thinking about implementing, talking to each other about implementing? Thank you.
Great. Who wants to start in?
I can start very quickly with the first question about how do we engage with different on-the-ground stakeholders with regards to like the power dynamic that exists between funder and grantee, et cetera. I mean, look, I think the power dynamic, I mentioned I come from civil society. Even for me, it was difficult to kind of grapple with that, to understand that I was on the other side of the table. I kept saying we, as organizations. But I think my approach has been to have really just radical honesty with the individuals that I'm speaking with, to really set the expectations in terms of what we're expecting, what they should expect, and make sure that whatever power dynamic that does exist is diffused in a sense where we're equals in co-partnership and co-thinking and co-design. I try to do that as much as I can. Another thing too that we often do is, for instance, recently we've been talking about potentially doing a pooled fund on artificial intelligence and civil society organizations, and we had a consultation with some of our most trusted civil society partners together in a room, and I think that just flips the power dynamic on its head, because then you're only like 1 or 2 funders, and then 20 really like important people from civil society, and you're humbled in every single way. And so I think like that is also another way that I go about kind of rebalancing or finding some sort of equilibrium when it comes to the power dynamic. And again, I go back to radical honesty. To me, it comes very easily, because I think ultimately if we don't have honesty, then you can't really be tactical. So
I echo that 100%. I mean, look, it's true, too much of philanthropy is funder-driven, and every one of those efforts are going to fail. And I mean, I just flat out, I mean, when you talk about long-term change, I'm not talking about a project and accomplishing something. I'm talking about long-term change. Unless it is a collaborative effort in the way you were describing it, and unless there is non-funder input in shaping the direction of what funding occurs, you're going to fail, because you need that power on the ground to carry out the work. I think a second thing that we're really weak on is transparency. And, for funders, whether it's DAFs, that is donor advised funds, or whether it's even just the notion of funder collaboratives, it's hard as heck to find out who to go to get the dollars.
yeah.
And that's a downside of the funder collaboratives. What happens is the foundations all say, oh, I gave to the collaborative. And then, you don't even know what the collaborative is. I mean, I have a website that you don't know. So these are real problems that I think are easily solvable if you have a fundamental belief in the players that are carrying out the work.
Yeah. It's part of the same dynamic that's shifting or needs to shift in governance, all institutions. I mean, government in general, professionalized public life, has been good in many ways and has created a division between the people who are being served or who are standing up and people in government. And so that's the big shift in our lifetime, is how do you actually overcome that divide now in good ways that are deliberative, participatory, equitable, all those sorts of things. The same may be true in philanthropy. It sounds like part of what for examples of trust, for reasons of actual effectiveness, long-term change, that's part of the dynamic we're trying to shift.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the only thing I might add to the question of like influencing and affecting power that I found when I was on the grantee side is honestly what I think we've been talking about as the strengths of the grantors is the working together, teaming up with other folks with the same donors. Like sometimes the donor environment and a feeling of scarcity can feel like you're competing with related nonprofits, especially those who do work most closely to you. But I think when you're hearing the same message over and over from across a constellation of actors, it makes a much bigger difference. And so to the degree that we can be aligned and working together rather than competitively as organizations on the ground doing that work. And I come fairly recently from wearing that hat, and it's still an orientation I've got. That was always where I found more ability to influence funders, and I see sitting here how when I'm looking for patterns and trends, like more voices saying the same thing goes a long way. So teaming up and really, really speaking with one voice across more organizations can do a lot.
Awesome.
So I think the way we are trying to contribute to this question is just actually trying to make the idea of a multi-year thesis-driven philanthropic fund just like a unit of exchange that is much more clear. So we take a lot of inspiration from New Profit and a few others, but in my mind, we have to, like, rather than speaking about it very abstractly, we're like, hey, there should just be a class of an organization that looks like it is a 3 to 5 year fund. It has a lead. Maybe that lead is actually someone who comes out of the practitioner community. It has a goal. This is what we're trying to accomplish in 3 to 5 years. It has a capital call, like it goes out to donors and says, I'm trying to raise a $30 million check size. I will then deploy that money in the next 3 to 5 years against that goal. It doesn't give philanthropic returns back to those donors, but it has the same relationship where it says, here's what I'm going to do. I raise the money, I deploy it, I have a scorecard at the end. How did I do? And then I can raise more funds. So then there's a class of organization that basically is in the business of raising and deploying these funds. And I think the reason why that's, in my mind, very useful is you get to actually do it. Right? Which is you actually get to run the 3-year, 5-year strategy from beginning to end. You get to hire top practitioners who then want to be on the other side of the house. You get to have transparency. Each fund has a website. You can see who their LPs are, who gave them the money. So we have done this. So like we have something called the Public Benefit Innovation Fund. The goal of that fund is to raise $30 million to better run public benefit delivery systems using a bunch of emerging technologies. It has donors. The donors are listed. It has a fund lead. It is, like the new law passed, and 2 weeks later, we had a capital call out. We had an open RFP that said, hey, if you think this new law that the US government just passed is going to affect SNAP and WIC and Medicare, which it is, and if you have an idea for how to help states like deal with it, apply. And that funding call went live 2 weeks after the law passed and was open for 4 weeks. We got 350 applications. We're going to make awards in the next 3 weeks, right?
Yeah.
So like you can go way faster, but the point is just like we raised all the money up front.
Yeah.
There was no donors to go to say, oh, how are we going to, right? Because the money had already been raised. So I just think like some of these are structural things. It is going to be just hard if in the moment of opportunity, we also have to do all the other things. We have to go all to the donors and convince each board for how much, this is hard. Yeah. So I think we need to have more intermediaries that raise the capital up front and deploy. So that's how we're trying to solve it.
Awesome. Terrific. Thank you all. So thank you. We kept it snappy.
I hope.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you to Cameron and our colleagues at NCOC for convening us. And thanks to the panelists. And we'll be here to talk to people who have continued questions or thoughts or civil discussion afterward.
Absolutely.
Is that you?
It is not.